All right, now we will move into item number 8, Spruce Wash and Schultz Creek Watershed Update.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Scott Overton, serve as your Public Works Director. Here for the first time in a couple months for a post-wildfire flooding update for the newer members of our council. This will be your first real post-wildfire flooding update. Over the summer months and in the late fall, we presented this monthly, and many of you remember that cycle we kind of got into of giving you continual updates. We took the holidays off. I can assure you the work has not stopped. And this evening we're back in kind of a routine to now start presenting on post-wildfire flooding, but I will tell you the tone and probably the evening's presentation is going to look a little different than what you saw in the summer months, which was geared more towards response and more towards some of the short-term mitigations. And clearly now that we are outside of flooding season, you are going to see a focus this evening much more on some of our history, very, very briefly for some of our newer members and for those of you that might just want a quick refresher. But we're going to focus a lot on the Spruce Wash watershed update, where we're at since November with the bond passage, and kind of fill you in on what we've been working on since that approval by the voters. And then towards the last portion of the presentation, we'll get into Schultz Creek on the Pipeline West, portions of a post-wildfire burn scar, and then we'll of course give you plenty of time for discussion and questions. With me this evening, I have a number of experts that have been working with us throughout these years, and each of them will have a play within the presentation. And again, we really do welcome your conversation, your dialogue, and your questions, as this information is for you and for the public, and really should capture not only the brief history, but where we're at on a lot of these bigger projects and initiatives, as we really have tried to work our way towards a more resilient community post-wildfire burning, a more sustainable in response. Very quickly, there's two post-wildfire burn scars that we're dealing with primarily right now in the city. We have the 2019 museum burn scar that's burned in Dry Lake Hills. We also have the 2022 pipeline fire scar in Schultz Pass. We call that oftentimes Pipeline West. As you know, there is a big impact to the east side of the community as well, which we often refer to as Pipeline East. That is all county jurisdiction. So the two that affect the city limits are the museum scar and the Schultz scar. We had flooding on both burn scars in 21. We had significant flooding from the museum fire burn scar in the Schultz Creek watershed. Of course, that's through our Grandview area, Paradise, and Sunnyside neighborhood. And then this last season in 22, we didn't see the dramatic impact that we saw in Museum of 21, but we saw a shifted focus of response efforts to Pipeline West in the Schultz Creek watershed with repeated events this last summer. Both were active, both were ready for response, but we saw more need in the Schultz Creek side, Pipeline West, summer of 2022. I think I made a comment here in the slide deck that's pretty important. Post-wildfire flooding mitigation development is ongoing, and some of the best work in the nation is occurring as quickly as possible. I believe that. I will tell you, we hear from communities that are dealing with similar issues, and we are fortunate in Flagstaff to have some of the West's leading experts on how we deal with post-wildfire flooding, and you're going to hear from those engineers and experts this evening, and assure you that quickly and expedient is probably some of the more common verbs we use. You saw this in your packet, a little hard to read on the screen. The red area is the pipeline fire scar. The museum is that orange color, and you'll see that kind of burnt ember color, green, the tunnel fire. Watersheds are very different. They are designated with the dashed lines, but generally they flow into one watershed, and that's the takeaway from this slide, kind of a 3D rendering and a very nice illustration of what we're dealing with. Significantly, this next one is Spruce Wash. You'll see in the 2019 museum fire scar, the one single blue dashed line that runs just west of Mount Eldon into the Spruce Wash labeled line right down through the heart of Sunnyside. So that's the watershed that we're most focused on for the first half tonight. And then that second will be the Pipeline West, which drains into a couple watersheds, but primarily Schultz Creek watershed for impacts to the city. So Spruce Wash. We're going to kick this off, and I'm going to turn it over to Julie Lead with Peak Engineering, who is going to present the first couple slides on feasibility study phase 2.
Good afternoon, Mayor Daggett, members of council. Good to see you again. All right, so just a little background. Feasibility study phase 1. This was started last year when we looked at a concrete box culvert all the way from Linda Vista to Route 66 through the neighborhoods of Grandview and Sunnyside, Upper and Lower Sunnyside, all the way out to Sportsman's Warehouse area, 66. That is a project that is financially out of reach. At the time feasibility phase 1 was underway, the city partnered with Flagstaff Unified School District to build the Killip Regional Detention Basins. So Killip Regional Detention Basin is about the middle of that corridor, that Spruce Wash corridor. So the next step, feasibility phase 2, which we also call the Spruce Wash Watershed Management Plan, that is capturing the potential of the Killip Regional Detention Basins and working our way upstream. And that aligns with the bond dollars, thank you to Flagstaff voters, that passed in November. So this is fantastic and exciting work that we are thrilled to be moving forward with. So feasibility phase 2 is 3 parts. The first part is looking at the hydrology and the amount of recovery that has happened in the burned area in the watershed. So there has been some vegetation, some regrowth in that area. The canopy is not there. We've got J.E. Fuller, Hydrology, Geomorphology. Joe is here tonight. He's going to talk about that with you and kind of show you some of that recovery that we have seen and what that means for flows inside the urban corridor on Spruce Wash. The watershed has not recovered. We've seen improvement. It has not recovered. The flood risk still remains. So that's one part of feasibility phase 2. What are the current conditions? What does it mean? The second is moving that suite of projects forward. I'll show you that suite of projects, and that's to mitigate the flooding specifically in Grandview and Sunnyside. And then the third part of feasibility phase 2 is what does that mean? When all of those projects are completed, constructed, how does that impact flooding? What are the benefits that we see through the neighborhood? So here is your suite of projects, where the number 1 is, that is, just for orientation, that is the Cedar Safeway. And then you can see Route 66 in the bottom right corner. You have Cedar Avenue right where that number 5 is. We've got Sunnyside to the south of 5. And then Grandview is the roadway in between the numbers 1 and 4. So the first project in the suite of projects is reconstruction of Grandview Drive. Right now, Grandview Drive is a crowned street, has roll curb, and there's just not a lot of capacity within the roadway prism for stormwater conveyance. So what happens is Spruce Wash hits Linda Vista, and then it overtops at Linda Vista, and then it runs down Grandview. And that's where we saw some pretty significant impacts in 2021. So what we are proposing, which is a waiver to the engineering standards, is an inverted crown roadway. So what we're trying to do is pull where that water would typically flow in the front yards for folks or through the yards and pull more of that water into the roadway prism. So essentially, we're going to take the road and invert the crown. So we can have more capacity in the roadway prism. One added benefit to the residents on Grandview is we need to lower the city's infrastructure, the water and sewer. So that requires putting in new water and sewer infrastructure on Grandview at the same time we're doing the pavement. So that's going to be a good benefit. The facilities are aging, and that is included in the project scope as a necessary item. The second item is upsizing the Linda Vista crossing. So right now, there are a couple pipes there. We need to put in a larger box culvert, which will help pass more flow, obviously, and lessen the amount that overtops. The third project, I skipped, I'm sorry. I do know my 1, 2, 3s. That was the third one. Okay, the second one is the wedge detention basin. That's number 2, and that's the forested area immediately west of the Cedar Safeway, kind of where that slip lane goes, where you can catch Cedar to go up the hill. And it would be creation of a detention basin at that location. And then 3 I already talked about. 4, Cedar Avenue to Linda Vista Drive channel. Right now, that's an earthen channel. We need to expand its capacity. Likely a portion or perhaps all of it would be a hardened channel. What I mean by a hardened channel is concrete or shotcrete, a material that stands up to that scour that can happen in the channel. The 5th is the Cedar Avenue crossing. There's a box culvert there. It needs to be a lot bigger. From Cedar to Dortha, this is the project that was completed last year in the Dortha project. So channel improvements have been made between Cedar and Dortha, and that's about just above where the number 6 is there, the channel hardening that was done last year, and then the Dortha crossing. So project 6 is continuing that hardened channel from Dortha to Arroyo Seco, the townhomes. And then the 7th project in the suite is the Arroyo Seco Inlet. Right now, we have a temporary situation with large concrete blocks and some temporary fencing. It's working, but we need to put in something permanent. We also need to design it in a way that we move some of that water through Ponderosa Park and into the Killip Regional Detention Basins. So that Project 7 encompasses that conveyance into the Killip Regional Detention Basins. And I want to know, I have the list of recommended projects here at the bottom. Not recommended at the time is the wedge detention basin. And I want to say it's not recommended at this time in its current configuration, which is a considerable excavation at a considerable cost for about a 10% benefit to the overall system. We may still need to have something at the wedge. It just may not look as we have envisioned it so far. Maybe there's a way to dial that back. We need to see the benefit of some detention upstream so we don't cause conditions downstream that are unacceptable. Right. So we have put together a very rough timeline. Mr. Clifton gave us the challenge of how would you complete this in 3 years, which is incredibly ambitious. And we've been working as a team. We had a summit in October, the end of October, to say how could we pull this all together and what would this sequencing look like. And the purple bars are intended to represent design phase, pink is property acquisition, and the orange is construction. We also have the estimated dollar amounts. Those are construction costs. Those are not total project costs because there are design and project management that is also part of the project, but those are rough opinions of probable construction costs for each one of those. And what we had to do through our summit and our workshop with a large group of city staff and the whole consulting team is figure out, okay, what other projects are coming online? Like, we know that the 4th Street and Lockett roundabout is planned for construction in a certain year. Well, we need to think about sequencing of, well, if we have to shut that down, we can't also be constructing Linda Vista at the same time, for example. So that's part of how we've laid out this rough timeline. The city has advertised for a construction manager at risk, bringing that CMAR contractor on board. I think Scott's going to mention that in a moment, or Mac is. And we will be working with that CMAR contractor to refine this schedule. You see a very long bar at the bottom for the Grandview improvements. We're looking at utility replacement in one season and then roadway construction in another season. The wedge is grayed out. That can be a floater. It could happen. We'll see what that looks like as more information, more of the analysis is complete, and what piece of that may need to happen and when. All right. So with that, Joe.
Hi, Mayor and Council. I'm Joe Lovrich with J.E. Fuller. And like Julie said, a big piece of planning these improvements is understanding what the current conditions of the water. A lot of the emergency response and everything up to this point has been based on the immediate post-fire modeling that was done. And what we needed to do is just a refresh on the modeling to understand what the current conditions of the hydrology is, update it with the projects that have been built in the field. So what we did is we stepped through just a multi-step process to understand, okay, what do we feel the most reasonable current risk is to the watershed? So what we did was step back to our initial models, critiqued them to looking at the flood events that happened, what changes do we think should be made to those based on what we saw, what are the problems, what are the how did it work well, to make some changes. Then we spent some time in the field in November looking at many points across the fire. So we wanted to look at areas that burned severely, moderately, low severity, unburnt, in multiple areas across the fire with different landscapes, different veg types, to really get an understanding of what do we really feel the hydrology is saying at this point in time. So when you look up on the mountain, you can see a lot of grass. You can see there are some aspen regrowth on some of the slopes when you get up more towards the Eldon side. There is recovery happening, but what is the scale of that recovery is the question. So with all of our field data, we came up with an initial pass at, hey, based on this is what we feel the hydrology is saying, so we adjusted our model. Along with that, we wanted the hydraulic updates, so geometry changes that have happened in the watershed. There's the alluvial fans that have been constructed on the main tributaries, the main Spruce Avenue wash and the west tributary, across the Bayless property up by Mount Eldon Estates, and then behind Buffalo Park, the Paradise fan that's in there. So those influence how the water flows through those areas. And then finally, we wanted to calibrate this. So we have, if we look at the data that we have, and we say, okay, what can this data tell us? Well, we know that in 2021, there was a lot of big flood events. Those flood events corresponded to big rainfall events in the watershed. Come 2022, did I say that right? That was 2021. 2022, we still had a number of rainfall events, but those rainfall events were smaller than 2021. So inherently, the flows that are coming off the watershed are going to be smaller. So just by looking at the flood events that came down through the city and say, hey, we didn't get much water this monsoon, the flood risk is gone, is an incorrect statement. So what we have is a lot of calibration data for small storms. So we can look at those. We don't have that calibration data for large storms for this year. But what we have is a feel for what we think the watershed is, how it could respond. So this is just at 3 different points. The graphs, what they show are for a 1-minute or a 1 inch and 45-minute event. This is kind of our design rainfall, 1 inch in 45 minutes or 2 inches in 45 minutes. You can see that at each of these places, pre-fire, there was really no runoff with a 1 inch event. Immediate post-fire, you know, a big uptick in the discharges. And at this point in time, we feel like those 1 inch discharges could see a significant decrease from what we initially modeled. And that really plays in line with what we saw come through the city during those flood events and what we saw in all the monitoring cameras that are up in the watershed. The 2 inch and 45-minute, we didn't see these storms this last year. We saw these storms on the pipeline west and the pipeline east, but not on Museum. And so we stepped from pre-fire, very low flows, immediate post-fire, really high, and we feel like that flood risk maybe has come down between 20 and 30%, depending on where you're looking at it. So it's still there, it is recovering, but there is still a risk. And so that's the baseline we're using right now for the improvements that are being proposed. And this is something that is continual progress as the watershed recovers.
Thank you, Joe. So here's the good news, is these years of efforts and these years of understanding translated to us developing a proposal to the voters. And at the time, the council forwarded the question in November, and it was approved by 76% of the voters. So we had a high approval rating of this Proposition 441, which provided $26 million of resource. I would like to point out, remember, Feasibility 1 was about 95 to 100 million, minus property acquisitions, not included, excuse me. So 26 million is about a quarter of the original fix, but we knew we could make meaningful progress with this amount of funding. And so the focused effort has been kicked off, and it kicked off actually a few days before the election. We started to plan kind of a what-if summit. Okay, if we're receiving some funding, how do we start thinking about this the day after the election? And really that's what happened. With that success, we knew that we wanted this construction to follow our feasibility phase 2 process. This data is super important. It's going to verify and make sure that we're doing the best with the resource we have for the greatest benefit to our residents, and to make sure we're at least being as realistic as possible with likely storm events. That engineering design kicked off very, very quickly. Of course, the intent is to mitigate these issues, and as Joe explained, we have seen some recovery. However, the risk is still fairly great for this watershed. Here were the things we knew we needed to do. We had to have a commitment. We had to have a commitment from water services and stormwater, public works and the response effort, capital improvements, our engineering teams, all of our internal service groups within the city. So start thinking of all the people that we utilize to help us deliver things. Our procurement people, our legal folks, our real estate professionals, every single group within the city that might have an impacted need within this was tasked with understanding what it meant for a positive voter box. So internal service groups, they all came to the table. We knew our community engineering resources were already working hard and diligently. We were going to need more of their resources, so they were all notified quickly. And then, of course, probably the most important last one is our residents. We all tried to put ourselves in their shoes and understand at our summit that they are impacted the most, and our efforts make a difference. Our contributions to this community are significant, and our focus was to be on the long-term mitigation improvement to make meaningful impact. This entire team put this in thought. We created the Technical Advisory Committee shortly after the bond passage. I included the intent statement because I think it's a really important intent statement. The intent of our TAC, which now meets weekly since the bond, of the same group and professionals I spoke of a moment ago. There's about 35 of them in this technical group. We discuss and coordinate the work effort between the city divisions and consultants for the 22 funded Spruce Wash project delivery and engineering. That's it. But it is a coordinated effort, and it is focused, and this TAC is really a good production in what we get done. Once they started to meet, they started to develop the path forward. They had the results of phase 2, they had the modeling. We started to now translate the $26 million into reality. We took that timeline and compressed it into what Julie showed, those simple bars of design and delivery, and then we involved some more folks. I'm going to let Mac speak to what he is now working through with the funding and the engineering support.
Thanks, Scott. Good evening, Mac McNamara. I'm a project manager with the capital improvements section at the city. I'm briefly going to walk through our project delivery plan. Our delivery method is going to be a construction manager at risk. It's also known as a CMAR. A request for statement of qualifications was advertised on December 15th of 2022 for a CMAR. That advertisement closed January 13th, and we received 5 statements of qualifications from contractors. We are currently reviewing those 5 statements of qualifications, and we'll be scheduling interviews for early February, if need be, to make a CMAR selection. CMAR contract negotiations and project scheduling will take place in February with our selected CMAR. We will then be back to council in March to award the CMAR contract. A notice to proceed and guarantee maximum price number 1 will be brought to council by end of May. And then lastly, the intent is to start construction in the fall of 2023 after monsoons. Construction will continue through 2024 and 2025 to complete all the projects. Let's see, next slide. Currently, survey and design is underway, and as Julie went through, these below here are a suite of projects. We'll be back next month to go through these in further detail. And I'll turn it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Mac. And you know, Mac covered it very, very quickly. I can't express enough gratitude towards every city employee that has pitched in on this effort. We condensed the CMAR construction manager at risk process, our delivery tool, by months to try to meet our deadlines, and everyone's checking their boxes and doing as quickly as possible, good, efficient work, so we can get the greatest benefit out of that 26 million. And we were excited to have 5 respondents. They're in review, and we're really going to look forward to bringing you those proposals and that award in the next couple months. So it's a great project. I think the excitement is high, and everybody's excited to be working on it. We're thankful to the community. We're thankful to your continued support. That really sums up all of Spruce Wash. We covered a lot of material. We got you caught up, and we didn't cover response. We didn't cover short-term mitigations. Tonight's focus was, what are we doing to focus on the long-term mitigations? And I think that was the focus of the presentation. We can either stop here and take questions that you might have on Spruce Wash, or we can get through Schultz Creek and just take them all in combination. It'd be your pleasure.
Let's go ahead and take the next presentation and then have all of the questions at once.
Sounds good. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed from our stormwater group to talk Schultz Creek with you.
All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So I'll be going over, just like Scott and the rest of the team did, we'll do a crash course on Schultz Creek, so Pipeline West. So working through this here, we'll talk about the mitigations that we're doing for the flood threat in Stavana Way, Coconino Estates, downtown and south side as a result of that fire. So moving from the upstream to the downstream, we'll talk a little bit briefly about the detention basins at Eldon Lookout Road. Those are complete and functioning. And then the channel between those basins and Highway 180, there's 2 projects in that section. One is a county-driven one for the replacement of the culvert at Eldon Lookout Road. They are working through design right now. And the other one is a city one, which I'll talk about briefly. And then the Highway 180 crossing, so the culvert at Highway 180, which is in design and survey as we speak, and the Highway 180 to Rio de Flag, which is the same project, just a different component. And then briefly talk about, again, we're not talking about too much mitigation here, but we'll briefly mention what's going on at Francis Short Pond. So again, those detention basins were completed this summer, or this fall. Great work, less than 4 months after the fire, we had these complete. 2.4 million out of NRCS Emergency Watershed Protection, as well as the 25% match out of the State Department of Forest and Fire Management. So a huge win to the community. Despite that, we still do have considerable flood threat. This helps mitigate that flood threat coming off the Schultz Creek, but it does not completely mitigate it for the communities downstream. As I mentioned, we have the county project on Eldon Lookout Road, and then immediately downstream of that, we have a need for channel stabilization. So this is probably a little hard to see, but you can, this picture here was taken after a few of the flood events. This channel is starting to unravel with those large flood events that have come through. And even with those detention basins, we are going to have heightened flow coming out of the basins. So maintaining these channels so they do not scour and produce sediment, debris into the neighborhoods and into the downtown area is rather important. So this will be funded out of, again, that Emergency Watershed Protection set of funds, EWP, out of the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, out of Department of Agriculture. So that fund, the EWP fund, has been refunded by the omnibus bill at the federal level in December. So we are still waiting for the details on that, but there should be funding in the next year or two for this project, which will be putting a series of channel stabilization bars through the channel from Eldon Lookout Road to Highway 180 on private lands. Schultz Creek Highway 180, we are moving forward with design survey. Our surveyor and designer is Shepard Westminster, this is SWI. They are working through design on what we were calling option 2 last year, which is slightly up from where the current culvert is. It goes under the Mount Calvary Lutheran Church parking lot and soccer field, and then connects to the Rio de Flag. So if you're looking at this image here, the current culvert is right here and goes under part of Highway 180, where it has 3 different size changes, constricting down each one of those before going under Stavana Way and hitting the Rio de Flag. This concept shows that we'll be recreating the channel with a straight shot with dual box culverts, concrete culverts underneath Highway 180 and then underneath the parking lot, the soccer field, before outletting with energy dissipation in the Rio de Flag. So when this is complete, it should provide substantial improvements for the downstream communities. So we are working through design and survey. We also have real estate and legal working on the property rights and acquisition side. And then funding is being worked at from several different angles as we speak. And then just very briefly, again, not really want to get too much into mitigation here, short-term mitigation. But we have drained Francis Short Pond as best as we could. It seems to keep on raining and snowing on it. So it actually does hold a lot of water right now, even though the drain is fully open. And the purpose for this is we lost over 20% of the capacity of the pond this year due to ash and fine sediment that entered the pond. The pond did do what it was originally designed to do in 1923. It did provide a really great flood mitigation for downtown and south side. So we actually had operators out there before every event lowering the pond elevation so that the pond could refill with the floodwaters that are coming down off of Schultz Creek into the Rio de Flag. And due to that, we had very minimal overtopping of the banks in the south side community. But because it is in line, it did trap all the ash and sediment that was coming down out of the Schultz Creek that made it that far. So our hope is to dredge this to get back to its original capacity. Likely going to be slightly delayed just with the amount of snowpack we have up on the peaks, but we are hoping to get this done before monsoon season. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about communications. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Sarah Langley, Public Affairs Director. So I'll wrap up our presentation tonight with a quick overview on the communications and public outreach that we continue to do on post-wildfire flooding. in our community. So Public Affairs has been and continues to work with Beta PR, which is a local PR firm. They're based here in Flagstaff, and luckily they know a lot about the neighborhoods that we are working with for post-wildfire flooding. We have a list of different tools that we use to communicate with both of the impacted communities. A lot of these we've been using previously, but we do have a few new ones that we're trying out as well. I hope the new council members have all seen our e-newsletters that should be going to your email addresses. There's an example of one there for Museum Fire up on the screen, and we send those out periodically when there are things that the community should know, updates we have on different projects or new funding, anything like that. For those residents who are not online or maybe don't have access to the internet, we have a series of physical information boards placed in both of the impacted areas so that residents can stop by and read about the latest updates. One of the newer tools we're trying is on-site banners or sandwich boards. So these are big 3-by-5 foot banners that we place at different project sites so that if you're walking by, I always wonder, what are they doing there? That way you can see what's going on. So there on screen is an example of a banner that we've put at the Francis Short Pond to let people know what the city is up to. We also have websites for both of the impacted areas. We update those frequently to make sure they stay up to date. And then we use physical mailed flyers and door-to-door flyers for important updates, things that we need to make sure everybody sees. We go ahead and mail those out. We, of course, are in direct communication with a lot of residents through email to answer their specific questions. And then lastly, we use community meetings periodically. And that brings me to my next slide. We will be holding a community meeting specifically for the Spruce Wash Museum flood area. So those are Paradise, Grandview, and Sunnyside neighborhoods. Those residents are all invited to Chambers next Thursday. So it's February 2nd at 6 p.m. We'll have an informative presentation that will focus on the Prop 441 projects. And then it just provides a great opportunity to let residents come and ask questions and have, really detailed conversations with staff and with our engineers as well. So I think I have 2 more slides. I always leave these in every presentation more for any residents who may be watching. If you are a resident in the museum flood area or the Spruce Wash, you can visit museumfloodprojects.com for more information. We also have our email address and phone number there on the slide. And then for those on the west side of Flagstaff in the Pipeline West area, the website is flagstaff.az.gov/pipelinewest. And again, we have that email address and phone number. So with that, Mayor and Council, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and take public comment. I think we probably have a lot of questions and comments among us. So if Ms. Kessler, would you come up for public comment?
Thank you. Hello again, and thank you so much for letting me go over time with my comments at the last question. I just have, I am impacted. I live on Mead Lane in Coconino Estates, and thank you so much, everybody, for working so hard. I actually used to live in, I had a house for 20 years out in Timberline on Saddle Avenue, and that's one of the reasons why I moved into town was because of the Schultz fire. Had sandbags around the house, anyway, I'm very familiar with the whole, fire situation since 2010. I thought Coconino Estates was a nice, safe place from floods and fires, and then boom, it happened. So have sandbags around my house again. We moved them around for the winter, but I still have them. My question is, I'm so happy to see that you've got that channel going. You're working on that channel from Schultz Creek by ACE, Arizona Conservation. My friend works there, by the way. I heard all about what happened there. And the Rio is so close to the road there where it backs up. And I'm really happy you have that channel going through. When will that be completed? Because I think that's one of the big problems we have on Mead Lane is the water not getting to the Rio, which is just 3 houses away from where I live. And when will that be completed? And until then, is there any temporary mitigation that can be done to prevent water from not coming into our neighborhood and getting to the Rio, even though the project has not been completed yet there? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, Ed. And if I could tack on a question to the 180 culvert question, how much more money do we need in order to do that project?
All right, so it sounds like 3 questions there, possibly. One is the timing. So the timing for the new culvert, if I'm understanding that correctly, the timing on the new culvert at Highway 180. That's still a little bit up in the air. Obviously, we're moving as fast as we can, but we have to get through design, survey, property acquisition, and then there's also quite a bit of coordination between ADOT, who has Highway 180, who are on board. We talk with them quite a bit. These meetings that Scott was mentioning, these weekly meetings, as well as our monthly meetings and the meetings we have with the flood control districts. We have multiple tiers of technical advisory committees, which most of us are on. We do meet with ADOT, with their engineer here in town. So we'll be working with them, obviously, and then there also is a county intersection there as well. So we'll be working with the county on that as well. But to give you a solid time, I unfortunately do not have a time yet for a Highway 180 when that will be completed. The other question was shorter term mitigation. So shorter term, how can we get the water that does get over Highway 180 at that constriction? How do we get that back into the Rio as fast as we can? There's not a whole lot that's really great in terms of ways to make that happen. We do have sort of a bathtub effect in Stavana Way, as well as the northern side of Coconino Estates. So it kind of holds the water. Once it goes over at 180, it kind of holds the water. It's really hard to get it back into the Rio. There was a temporary non-engineered ditch that was constructed in Stavana Way that helps move some of that water into the Rio. We do have a design, and that's on a private property. We do have a design for making that a little bit more robust, and we're still in conversation with that private property owner of how that might look or what might needs to be done to provide that short-term mitigation. That will help it drain faster, but there will still be impacts, obviously, in the neighborhood. And then the third question was amount of funding. Unfortunately, it is a rather expensive endeavor since it is a fairly large box culvert, or series of box culverts underground. It's slightly new channel, and then obviously the energy dissipation within the Rio de Flag as well. So when we first cost that out, it was about $5 million total. We do expect ADOT to help fund their portion, so within their right of way. We don't have the exact numbers on that, but roughly $1 million if we had to put an estimate to it. So we're still short about $4.4 million on the total project. And of course, this is an estimated cost. It may be much lower. I don't think it'll be much higher. I think we're trying to be conservative on that opinion and probable cost. But that is the range that we have for that.
Do we have a lead on funding sources?
I think there's a few different things at play here. I know, and I don't know where we are at with it, but there are some House bills to attempt to pay for it, externally, whether that's at a state or federal level. We did reach out to Federal Highway Administration last fall to see if we would be qualify for emergency funding. Unfortunately, they did not see that deemed it's not eligible under the Federal Highways emergency funding due to the fact that the highway itself was not damaged, even though it was closed obviously 5 times due to overtopping. So we can't tap that amount. We have also tried with EWP, I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Unfortunately, road crossings do not qualify under EWP. We've also reached out to FEMA, DEMA, so DEMA being the state version of the emergency management agency, So we are working multiple different avenues to see if there's ways to fund it. And then obviously I'll be back here next week talking about stormwater rates, and that will be another way to fund it within the community as well.
Thank you. All right, council. Yes, I believe nothing online. So,
Question.
oh, Stacy, did you say something?
I did not, Mayor. No, we don't have anybody online for comment.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Thank you so much. This question is for Julie or Scott, I believe. Julie can probably take it. It's about the Wedge detention basin. You mentioned in your description, it's that forested area over by the Cedar Safeway, right? I'm really fuzzy on what that would look like if that project were to be completed. And my concern, you know, the red flags that fly up in my head is that we're gonna lose all those trees in there, and that's gonna, that area, it'll probably regrow eventually. But can you talk more about that? I would hate to see that wedge become a bald patch. I just, if there's a way to avoid that, I would like to consider that as much as possible. And given that this project is iffy to begin with, you guys might be of the same mind there.
Thank you for the question, Vice Mayor. Yes, I think we share the same concern. What it would look like, it would be, so when we approached the concept design, we said, well, how much could we possibly fit at this location? What would be the maximum amount of volume of stormwater that we could put there? And if we excavate down, so this would be complete removal of all of the trees in that wedge and excavate down as far as we can go, we could fit about 2 Killip regional detention basins at that location. So about 15 acre feet at that location. That may not be what we need. And we recognize, I mean, it comes with a large cost too. To get it there, to get the infrastructure and the piping from Linda Vista to the wedge is very expensive. And then it's the impact as well to that basin. So I kind of envision it in the concept is something similar to the detention basin at the I-40 TI by Mountain Line. You know how they have that large basin out there off of Caspar? That kind of give you a sense of what that could look like, where you have vegetation but no trees. So we are dialing it back as much as we can. The tricky part is that when we send more water to Killip and we send more water to the channel, we have to be careful that we aren't sending more water to the folks that live south of 6 in a way that's unacceptable. That all of a sudden folks that live south of 6 who haven't experienced flooding prior would suddenly experience flooding because all of a sudden we're pointing it in that direction. So what we're doing is we're walking that back a little bit and saying, okay, well, to avoid that, how much do we need to have at the wedge? And this has been the hot conversation for the past 2 weeks, is dialing that back. So perhaps maybe it's half of that footprint. But we are very sensitive to the tree removal and what that would look like for the community.
Okay, thank you. I don't need to go into it deeper now, but make a little note there that I'm not happy about the aesthetic of that process, although I will always be supportive of what needs to be done for the science and the engineering to keep our neighborhoods safe. So bear that in mind as well.
Absolutely noted. Thank you.
Councilmember McCarthy?
Well, thank you, Mayor. There was an affordable housing project that was planned just west of Bashes in a little kind of triangle of is it Safeway? I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, Safeway. I should know that. I've been in it. Is that on hold, or is that still going to happen?
I can't speak to the housing development, but that parcel is not in play for any stormwater work.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
City Manager?
Pardon me, not in play for any housing at this time.
Okay, I have several questions. Julie, and this is more in terms of our future planning. You mentioned that because Grandview has the indent and, no,
Inverted crown?
inverted crown and rolled curbs, it was difficult to really move that water. So would you say that engineering-wise, straight curbs in terms of stormwater movement tend to be better than rolled curbs?
I think, Mayor Daggett, it comes down to really capacity. So right now, Grandview has a crowned street, so it's like this, and then it has rolled curb. In general, rolled curb doesn't have that much capacity, but when we go to a standard vertical curb, we increase that capacity by a couple of inches. And it's a surprising amount when you do the calculations on even just a couple of inches extra of curb can add quite a bit of capacity into a roadway system. So folks from the public might be wondering, well, what does that mean for us? It means new driveway aprons that will slope up to match into folks' driveways. To be able to work that vertical curb in instead of rolled curb.
Thank you, and please stay there because the next one's for you too. Ponderosa Park, is the final hope to be able to have water conveyance through there temporary where residents could have use of the park back again?
Mayor Daggett, yes, the intent is to have a mitigation, a conveyance through Ponderosa Park where the park is still usable. We recognize the importance of that amenity to the community. And so we've had thoughts about, well, could we make it a multi-use, multifunctional channel, or does it need to go underground? That's actually a design that SWI is working on. I think Stephen and Kayla are here. So if you do have specific questions about that design, that piece through Ponderosa Park is a grant-funded project that's outside of the bond work, but we need to connect our design into that grant-funded piece.
Thank you. And this next question, I think could be for either you or Jay, but it struck me when Jay was talking about the rainfall that we had last year, and I'm talking on the museum, the Spruce wash and mitigation that we've already done, like with the Dorotha project. When you said that we didn't have the flooding, were you saying that our recent mitigation hasn't been tested yet? Or would you say that mitigation that we've done partially was responsible for not having the flood events in that neighborhood?
Mayor Daggett, I think it's a mix. When some of those flood events came through, some of the wheel fans were built up on the forest. I think that helped for those events, drop out the sediment, so the water was cleaner coming down in. And then by that time, the channel was there for the, Cedar to Dorotha and into that pipe. That helped. So they kind of all played together, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, everyone. Scott, the Technical Advisory Committee, does the county, what's the county's involvement in that? Do they sit in on the meetings, or you're still meeting regularly with the county?
Yeah, so that's another really important piece, our relationship with the Flood Control District and the county efforts. For our local Technical Advisory Committee, the Monday meetings I'm referring to, the focus of that group is only the city-sponsored, city-portion, bond-funded projects. But to Joe's point, they're all related. we're looking at the greater system. So a number of these consultants and engineers also sit on the county teams doing the exact same work on Forest and the exact same work in the other burn scars. I would say that the communication is strong between those two, but direct involvement in the TAC, we keep them apprised, but we do not have county involvement as we're dealing with city infrastructure.
Makes sense. Stay there.
Okay?
Please.
Yeah.
This wasn't mentioned, so I don't know if it's going to be part of a future presentation, but the Park Street project, is that still in play?
Parkway Basins.
Parkway Basin, there we go.
It is. We currently have been working with, now that one is a unique project. That is a county-funded project using some funding that was received last year. And we are working through design iterations and what is the greatest benefit to the entire system. We do hope to bring you kind of a further update on that soon, but that one definitely has nuances and calculation benefits and, again, the entire system. But that is something that we continue to work diligently on, and it was also a topic of conversation in the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. And my final question, I believe, Ms. Kessler asked about, is there any temporary fix, near-term fix in terms of Meade and Stevana? Will we be having a presentation on personal mitigation options? Like, how are residents in that area going to be informed about what steps that they can take? And I'm guessing it's going to be similar to last summer, but what steps that they can take to mitigate while we are working on the other projects?
Yeah, I would anticipate a fairly thorough presentation closer to spring, before summer months clearly. But our focus tonight has been more on longer-term mitigations. I think you would see very similar presentations than what you've seen in the last 2 years, dealing with short-term mitigations, the best advice we can provide our residents, the best support we can provide them. I will caveat this and warn everyone that what we've seen in the past was financially feasible because we weren't transitioning to longer-term mitigations. Really, the funding focus has shifted to get to long-term mitigations as quickly as possible. But that has also put a lot of limits and much more restrictive practices on flood control district dollars and on city local dollars. We know that our money is better spent on long-term mitigations and not response. So if there are sandbags on site, we're going to talk about reuse. We're going to talk about how they can utilize the product they have already. And then our hope is the projects that we're delivering have meaningful impact and we can start to communicate what that will look like, and those mitigations might change. But again, until these are all in place and working as a system, we're probably not completely out of that risk hazard. I think that was pretty fair to say generally, or will be in the spring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that was my last one, so thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, did anyone else work up any questions or comments? All right, so thank you very much for the presentations. So item number 9, we have another call for public participation, and as a reminder, this is to allow the public to address the council about items that are not on tonight's agenda. So do we have any public participation?
Mayor, we do not.
Thank you very much.